The title of the book is The First Communist in Fort Jameson. Subtitle, Recollections of Africa and Other Places, 1955 to 2018. Chapter 1, Beginnings, 1936 to 1960. Section 1, A Family. I was born in what was then the London borough of Paddington in 1936, the younger son of John Watt and of Esme née Hall. We lived in St John's Wood, on the corner of Abbey Road, a little beyond the famous pedestrian crossing on the sleeve of the Beatles' record. I suppose there are interesting or eccentric characters in most families, and mine is no exception. The Watt folklore was that our ancestor had come from Scotland and been a partner in the brewery Courage, McCorquodale and Watt, and that he had sold his share in it. The official history of the brewery makes no mention of any Watt, but what is certain is that by the 1850s, the Watt family was fairly prosperous and living in Blackheath, now part of London, but then on the edge of the countryside. My grandfather, Richard Ernest, was a totally unflappable character, a lawyer who commuted to town every day. Although he was generous to others, he would walk to the next bus stop to save a halfpenny on the bus fare. He loved children and would have liked to have had more of them. But the health of his wife, who was in fact his cousin, meant that my father was an only child. I knew Grandad when he was old and deaf. When asked why he had no teeth, he would reply that he must have swallowed them. At the time of my parents' wedding in 1927, hordes of elderly Watts were still alive. I'll only mention three. Aunt Mabel was my granddad's bossy sister, and she appears later in my story. Uncle Watty had only one eye, the other one having been poked out by his brother. He wore gloves, 2 pairs of trousers and an overcoat, even in the summer. Aunt Eva, who always wore a bonnet, had married a rich brewer in a possibly vain attempt to save him from the evils of drink, and in the process she had inherited a great deal of money which she proceeded to give to good causes. And although I was a baby when she died, she left a little of it to my brother and me. Luckily, this money was protected in a trust, or my father would have certainly have spent it. My father grew up in his family's gloomy Victorian house, and he was a rebel from the start. He was sent to public school and loathed it. He always said that his atheism dated from the day at school when he heard the news of the bishops blessing the guns. It was 1914. He studied chemistry, but never finished his degree. He had various small jobs, including painting a frieze in the restaurant at the British Empire exhibition at Wembley in 1924. He volunteered to drive a tram during the general strike of 1926. His stint as a tram driver ended when, one night, he drove it off the rails and told the angry passengers to walk home. He was briefly a reporter at the Daily Express before landing a job of a newsreader at the new BBC studio in Northern Ireland. This was the birth of radio, and he'd arrived at the right moment. He was excited by this new medium. He was full of ideas and energy, and was soon producing plays and radio shows on very low budgets, as well as doing the continuity work. He was soon promoted back to London, where his first big success was Music Hall, where he pioneered the idea of having live audiences at broadcasts. He introduced the radio show that was always associated with his name, Songs from the Shows. His successes continued, and before war broke out in 1939, he was appointed as BBC's Director of Variety. He was what today we would call a celebrity. During the war, he was responsible for many of the morale-boosting radio programs, including Happy Drome, Workers' Playtime, Bandwagon and Itmar. He was known as Mr. Variety. He even featured as number one on a series of cigarette cards. As a man who swore, smoked and drank a lot, he was not loved by the very rigid Lord Reith, the BBC Director General. But I don't think this was the cause of his resignation at the end of the war, aged only 45. He was offered lots of good jobs, but chose to run a summer show at Butlin's holiday camp at Skegness. That year the weather was hot, so few people went to the theatre. He lost most of his money, and I know my mother was not at all pleased. He always had a nice sense of humour. He edited a book, Radio Variety, with a dedication to Miss Cushion, without whose filing system this book would have been written in half the time. He never went into television, saying he'd been a pioneer once and that was enough. But he continued to freelance with Family Favourites and Housewife's Choice and Songs from the Shows on BBC Radio. I remember going to meet him and Gracie Fields at a shabby little studio by a bomb site off Baker Street, where they were recording Whisk Half Hour. Whisk was a washing powder in those days. This was for Radio Luxembourg, but he'd really lost his energy. His health had never been good, and he went on drinking plenty of double gin with just a dash of Dubonnet. He used to come home with all 3 of the London evening papers. I remember him muttering one such night after a few drinks that he wished he'd been born black. I know he was very friendly with a very popular black singer, Leslie Hutchinson, known as Hutch. His early death in 1960 at the age of 59 was mainly due to his heavy drinking. He was not the sort of dad who spent a lot of time with the children, but I'm proud of this tribute from Gordon Glover, a fellow broadcaster and a neighbour, who wrote in the local paper that he was a 100% radio man, probably the greatest all-rounder within his field, which broadcasting has ever known or is ever likely to know again. My mother's family, the Halls, lived opposite the Watts in Kidbrooke Park Road. Her father was a tea planter in India. I remember the names of 2 Darjeeling estates, Pubong, still listed today, and Palandong. The company he part-owned, Stuart Hall, is still trading in Calcutta. He died when my mother was very young, but she remembers him as a stern and strict, typical Victorian father. He had a daughter, Minnie, by his first marriage, whose letter in the Congo is referred to later in the book. His second wife, my dear Granny, was the same age as her stepdaughter and very beautiful. Born in 1860, she lived until 1957. I knew her well towards the end of her life. She was still handsome, combing her long white hair. She would talk of her youth when she would smuggle herself into the theatre under a lady's crinoline. She had an old-fashioned turn of phrase. I remember her saying, "Upon my soul, I never did see such an ugly man in all my born days." And she shared the prejudices of many of her generation. There was a synagogue across the road. She would look out of the window at the gathering Jews and say, "Just look at them." And when the Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, divorced his wife, she remarked, "But I thought he was a nice man." She had 1 son and 3 daughters, of whom my mother was the youngest. Uncle Frank was an engineer who worked in Burma and Kenya and in later life commuted from Welwyn in his bowler hat and the Daily Telegraph. Like me, he liked trains. Frank used to tease me for my support of Indian and African independence, saying, "Nehru, Cowender, Nyerere, all scallywags." Aunt Winnie, or Helen Hall, had lived in the literary world of Bloomsbury. She wrote some good poetry. She worked as a kind of secretary to Rebecca West. H.G. Wells once gave her a scarf. C.K. Ogden published Basic English, a general introduction with rules and grammar in 1930, and she worked with him on other publications and the campaign to make this simplified version of English into an international auxiliary language. Competition for Basic English at that time came from Esperanto and French. Ogden's methods survive in EFL teaching, but today, with help from the internet, English, sadly the American version of it, has no competitor. In later life, Winnie became something of a hermit, devoted to her horse and to my mother. She taught me to ride, and I used to go to tea with her. In contrast to her radical youth, she became progressively more reactionary. Gladys, the other older sister, married a man that everyone else in the family took against, and so I never met him. They moved to Ireland during the war, as he loved meat and wanted to escape rationing. After his death, we became friendly with Aunt Gladys. She'd taken up Christian Science, which made her hopelessly optimistic. One day when she drove the wrong way round a roundabout, she said she was sure that God would preserve her. Luckily he did. Granny Hall had taken my mother and her sister to Germany to improve their education. They left for home just before war broke out in 1914. Gladys only just made it. She pretended to be Dutch and escaped through neutral Holland. My mother was sent to Parsons Mead, a boarding school at Ashtead in Surrey. She was not happy there and never passed any exams, yet she always loved words and she began to write verses and children's stories. She never gave up writing. Under her pen name of Angela Jeans, she published 10 novels, 3 children's books, a book about a tame owl, and a biography of my father, from which I gleaned some bits for this chapter. She usually got good reviews but poor sales. Her best book was Condemned to Life, which describes life after the arrival of Grandad and Aunt Mabel into our household after they were bombed out. Many of her short stories were broadcast as morning stories by the BBC. She loved my father, but the showbiz lifestyle didn't suit her. His infidelities and drinking finally caused a split 2 years before he died. She continued to live for many years in Arkston, Essex, in the picturesque cottage, Watt's Folly, which they had bought in 1936, for what was even then a bargain price of £140. The cottage is featured on calendars and tourist brochures and still looks beautiful today. My parents had an old gypsy caravan in the garden, and this was my bedroom when I was a teenager. My mother had strong principles, not least a profound hatred of war. After the bombing of Dresden, she wrote a letter to the Daily Express deploring the destruction. She received hundreds of abusive letters, blaming her for her Nazi sympathies. She was especially passionate about animal welfare. She had hundreds of china cats, as well as live cats, and latterly Brussels griffons and other small dogs. She was a strong character, very efficient, consistent, and a loving mother. My only brother, Christopher, known to us as Chimp, was born in Belfast. He was 6 years older than me, so I usually got bossed around when he was not away at boarding school. He left school at the age of 16 and got jobs in repertory theatres and was stage manager at several theatres, including the London Palladium. He was a fan of Gene Kelly and wanted to be a film star. Emigrating from gloomy post-war Britain, he started off as a ballroom dancing teacher in New York and ended up in Los Angeles as a director of NBC television. He loved railways, including especially model ones. In his retirement in Arizona, he built a huge layout for his model trains. In between writing parts of this book, I've been in Arizona helping Chimp's German-born widow Roswitha, photographer son Raymond, and accountant daughter Frances pack his thousands of models to ship to an auctioneer in England, and listening to Roswitha's memories of her childhood in wartime post-war Berlin. Section 2 is called Young Nigel. My parents had bought a rather dilapidated house, number 1 Blenheim Road, on the corner of Abbey Road, and modernised it in a very 1930s style. When I was born, a room in the basement was converted into a nursery. I was brainwashed with Disney. There were life-size cardboard figures of Mickey and Minnie Mouse and Pluto by the door, and a clock model of the Big Bad Wolf. My father actually knew Walt Disney personally, and we used to receive Christmas cards from him with bits of film attached. A nanny was employed, who apparently adored and spoiled me. To her I was the lamb. My earliest memory was looking up at the sun shining through the fog, and I remember being taken to watch the trains on the bridge at South Hampstead Station. The nanny had to return to Ireland in 1939 when war broke out. I missed being spoilt by her, and I became impossible, refusing to speak or look at anybody. I remained shy and unsociable for years. Toys were rare at that time, and to stop me playing with my grandmother's spectacles, she bought me a set of Mickey Mouse bricks. I still have a few of them. Before leaving London, we had a television set which showed BBC experimental programmes. These were stopped when the war broke out in 1939, and we never had a television until after my father's death. The variety and drama departments of the BBC moved to Bristol for safety in 1939, and we had to find somewhere to live nearby. We lodged briefly in Dunster in Somerset, where there were fleas in the bed and fish paste sandwiches every evening. Then we rented a house in Clevedon with a garden looking over the cliff to the Bristol Channel. I was sent to a nursery school in a convent. I remember nuns praying as the warplanes flew overhead. After a few months, we moved to nearby Nailsea, which was then quite a small village. I remember the sound of night raids. I fell into a duck pond in the garden and was dragged out by my brother, green with duckweed and choking. My mother used to take me on her bicycle to the primary school, where, still as unsociable as ever, I refused to shelter with the other children when there was an air raid alert. They had to put me under the table in the staff room. Air raids over Bristol soon led the BBC to move the variety department to Bangor in North Wales. On the day of the move, I had whooping cough, and I remember vomiting all over my grandmother on the long drive through Wales. We moved into a big, gloomy house across the Menai Bridge. This is where Grandad and Aunt Mabel arrived, as described in my mother's book. Aunt Mabel was constantly trembling with Parkinson's disease. They brought them a neurotic maid and an overfed cat. When my brother came on holiday, we played crazy games in the garden. Chimp made friends with the signalman at Menai Bridge Station, and we visited the next station up the line. The next station is called Llanfair Pwllwingich Go Gerich Go Indrobwyll Llandasilio Go Go Goch, and we learnt to translate the name. We were taken one day to Bethgelert and got lost exploring the remains of the former Welsh Highland Railway. This line reopened in 2009. We were conscious of the war. The Daily Express was delivered daily, and I remember looking at the black arrows on the map showing the advance of the Allied armies. On the radio, I remember the announcement of the death of David Lloyd George and also the Christmas broadcasts of Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. My father played the role of Bashful, so of course he hardly said a word. Section 3, Fig. In 1943, we left Wales and settled at Watts Folly. Chimp was already at the Friends' School in nearby Saffron Walden, and I followed him there. I was very happy there, and I became sociable at last. I was given the nickname Fig, a corruption of Nigel, and I was responsible for the nicknames of some of my fellows, names that some of them were keen to forget in adult life. On the morning of Election Day in 1945, we came down to breakfast, and the dining hall had been plastered with Labour Party posters and Down with Butler banners. Butler, R.A. Butler, the future Chancellor of the Exchequer, was the Member of Parliament for Saffron Walden, and on this occasion he very nearly lost his majority. Together with my school friend Kay Whiteman, later to become a great Africanist, we had the hobby of collecting film advertisements from the papers and sticking them into albums. With Kay, and with Brian Abbs, who was to become well known for revolutionising the teaching of English as a second language, we used to go to the latest epic films during school holidays, and later we collaborated writing songs and skits which were performed at the school. We wrote a musical version of Stella Gibbons' novel Cold Comfort Farm. Kay wrote the music, and we both worked on the lyrics and the dialogue. It was never performed. Going abroad was something special in the post-war period. My first taste of it was a holiday with my parents on the coast of Belgium in 1950. We stayed in the Grand Hôtel de la Plage in Heist, and my father discovered what was a then unknown little local beer called Stella Artois. Then, a year later, when I was in the sixth form, several of us went on an exchange visit to Paris, which included language lessons and visits to museums and chateaux. I stayed with a friendly family and improved my spoken French, but the boy who was my partner seemed only interested in mending bicycles. In 1952, I set off with my friend John Veit Wilson, known as Hanno, to cycle through Germany, from Düsseldorf down the Rhine Valley and through the Black Forest to Strasbourg, where we took a train home via Paris. The war had ended only 7 years earlier, and there were many signs of this. Strict border control, rusty signals, sidings overgrown with weeds, gloomy railway carriages, and many bomb sites. As a young child, Hanno had narrowly escaped from the Nazis, but he still had family contacts in Germany, and from them we learnt a bit about the post-war situation, including some signs of the future economic revival. At school, I was always good at geography, history, and languages. A charismatic Irishman, whom we called BBJ, taught geography, and his method was to teach us to recite incantations. One example relates to this book. The valley of the forested Belgian Congo, rich in oil palms and magnificent with its convergent waterways, but hampered in its economic development by the paucity of its native population. He didn't tell us about the many thousands who died under the rule of King Leopold II. When given the chance, I jumped at the option of learning German and dropping science. But I didn't study seriously until major exams came in sight. Then I did well, ending up with a state scholarship as well as a minor scholarship to St John's College, Cambridge. The first paid job I had was as an assistant at an archaeological excavation of the so-called battle ditches on the west side of Saffron Walden. This excavation proved that this trench was not a prehistoric earthwork, but dated from the 13th century. This job gave me a taste for archaeology to be followed up later in Zambia. Section 4, Railways. Railways were my greatest passion. Saffron Walden was on a branch line from our local station at Audley End. I would ride on the little steam train as often as possible. I also took an interest in local bus services, and at the age of 12, I wrote to the managing director of the local bus company Premier Travel, suggesting a number of new bus routes. He wrote back in detail, inviting me to meet the area manager, who would have been surprised if this small boy had turned up. In 1961, Dr. Beeching took charge of the railways and began closing lines as part of his modernisation plan. I wanted to travel on all the lines that were going to close. After a journey around a lot of threatened railway lines with Adam Kendon was another school friend, during the school holidays, we created the Society for the Reinvigoration of Unremunerative Branch Lines in the United Kingdom, acronym SRUBLUC. We formed a committee with classmates Tim Whitmore and Elizabeth Paul, and we held a conference in the old carriage which served as the waiting room at Ashton Halt, the next stop after Saffron Walden. Sometime in my last year at school, I remember seeing the headmaster to ask if I could take a day off school to travel on a line from Hawley to Laxfield in Suffolk, which was going to be closed. He got the timetable out and started lovingly mouthing the names of the stations: Brockford and Weatheringset, Aspel and Thorndon, Whirlingworth. His heart melted and he said I could go. Shortly afterwards, we wrote to British Railways to ask if SRUBLUC could rent this line. The answer, unsurprisingly, was no. However, soon afterwards, we travelled on the Kent and East Sussex Railway. Realising it was to be axed, we wrote to numerous newspapers proposing to save it. We received so many responses that as we left school, SRUBLUC started to become a serious lobbying association within the real world outside, with a mixture of older men joining our executive committee. We approached the poet laureate John Betjeman to be president. He was very supportive, but he proposed his friend Sir Arthur Elton. We would go fly posting, arriving in places like Monmouth or Brackley, which were likely to lose their trains, and sheepishly sticking up posters with the slogan, "Use or lose your railway line." We also used to record the number of passengers on particular trains, with a number getting on and off at each station. Our quaint acronym got us some publicity, but was too jokey for serious lobbying, and later on, when I was no longer active, SRUBLUC amalgamated with the Railway Development Association to become the Railway Development Society. It still exists, more active than ever as Rail Future. Congestion and environmental concerns have brought about a revival of rail travel, and Rail Future's efforts have led to many stations being reopened and rail services improved. This first experience of campaigning may have encouraged me to be involved later in issues of race and peace. 5. Non-military service. In 1954, 2 years military service was compulsory for 18-year-olds in Britain. Influenced by my education at a Quaker school and by my parents' loathing of war, I registered as a conscientious objector. This involved writing a statement to explain my reasons. I did not claim religious grounds, as I was not a convinced Christian. I had to go before a tribunal in Fulham Town Hall and face 3 stern-looking magistrates. Quite an ordeal at the age of 18. It seemed as if the Quaker influence did the trick, because 2 of the other would-be conchies were Jehovah's Witnesses, who refused to fight because they wanted to devote their lives to spreading the word. When asked if they would fight if God told them to, they said yes, so they were declared not to be real pacifists and were rather unfairly turned down. 6 years earlier, Chimp had also not been able to convince his tribunal, and when he refused the call-up, he spent a few months in Wormwood Scrubs and Lewes prisons, where he met with real criminals, including John Haig, the notorious acid bath murderer. When he later emigrated to the United States, he reluctantly accepted being drafted into the American Army. He was lucky that this was after the Korean War and before Vietnam. He got into the entertainment corps and managed to avoid having to fight. Having got through my tribunal, I was allowed to work in agriculture or forestry or in a hospital. Some of my Quaker friends ended up serving in the Friends Ambulance Unit, but I responded to a small ad in the Farmers Weekly and went off to work at Clint Grove, a farm in Worcestershire, at a wage of £4 7 a week, less lodging and national insurance. This was no ordinary farm. It was attached to Sunfield Children's Home, run by anthroposophists, followers of Rudolf Steiner. Chimp had been educated at Michael Hall, a well-known Steiner school, where my mother complained he never learnt to spell properly, so he concentrated so much on art and music. Clint Grove contained an interesting collection of residents, some of whom were middle-aged German ladies who had sought refuge from Hitler's Germany. The widow of the famous cellist Pablo Casals also visited, as did the actress Valerie Hobson. Valerie Hobson had married the politician John Profumo, and she stood by him strongly when he faced the scandal for which he is famous. Valerie Hobson's son was at the children's home. I learnt a bit about biodynamic farming and the wonders of compost, often called muck and magic, about Steiner's ideas on architecture, which included no square corners, and dance, eurythmy, and Goethe's theories of colour and science. When I was free, I spent weekends visiting home or travelling on some of the railway lines which were shortly going to close. I also fitted in a visit to Ireland with fellow founders of Shrubluck. Ireland felt more like the 1930s, with very few cars on the roads, numerous nuns on the trains, and the evening meal was always rasher and egg. We travelled on some memorable railway lines: the Hill of Howth Tramway, the Cavan and Leitrim Railway, the County Donegal Railway, the Sligo, Leitrim and Northern Counties Railway, the West Clare Railway, lines from Cork to Courtmacsherry and Bantry, and from Farranfore to Valencia Island. These lines are all now distant memories. We took the horse-drawn tram from Fintner Junction, where the horse had to hide in a stable as it was frightened of the noise of the steam train. We stayed in Tummon's Temperance Hotel in Enniskillen, and in the Cork establishment for antisocial Protestant youth. One night in Donegal we slept next to a hearse in a barn on a stack of hay, and we slept twice, with permission, in trains standing in sidings. It was all very friendly and laid back. I quite enjoyed farm work at Clent Grove. It consisted of market gardening, mostly weeding, looking after chickens, sheep, cattle and pigs, and occasionally driving the tractor. Jim Harper, who managed the farm, was not an anthroposophist, but a pacifist and a socialist. My other colleague on the farm, Frank Wheatley, informed me that I was allowed to take part in international voluntary work camps as part of my alternative service. After over a year at Clent, I applied International Voluntary Service for Peace, IVSP, and became a long-term volunteer, attending one work camp after another and receiving pocket money and travel costs. My decision to be a volunteer was to influence much of my future career. To get to my first IVSP work camp, I took the non-stop Elizabethan Express from London King's Cross to Edinburgh and continued to Glasgow, where I was one of a group of 20 volunteers who slept and cooked in an old church hall in the city. Each day we would take the tram and go to grim tenement flats, tear down old wallpaper and paint the walls and window frames and chat with the elderly tenants. They seemed to appreciate our work, while being somewhat amazed at all these foreigners who had problems decoding the local accent. A letter I wrote at the time records that the volunteers were, apart from me, Pakistani, white and black African, German, Yugoslav, a Polish refugee, Swedish, English, Swiss, Austrian and Spanish. After my fairly sheltered childhood, I was shocked at the living conditions in the tenements where we worked, but I took immediately to the communal life and the international ambience of the work camp. After 2 weeks in Glasgow, including a few more rides on railway lines, I took the overnight boat to Belfast for my second work camp. My only knowledge of the politics of Northern Ireland was the memory of having to show our passports at some not very friendly border crossings during our rail tour in 1954, and a book I had seen in the school library showing how the constituencies had been gerrymandered in favour of the Protestants. On the bus to the work camp, I was amazed to see Union flags everywhere. It was July. It was a peaceful time in the province, and our project was not at all political. We painted the rooms in Childhaven, an orphanage run by the Belfast Central Mission, set in a wood within earshot of the sea at Millisle in County Down. We stayed in a cottage in the garden and got to know the orphan children, taking them out rowing and fishing. I reported back to the IVSP office in London and was then sent to SCI work camps abroad. IVSP, now IVS, is the British branch of the international movement SCI, described below. I set off to my camp in Austria, first by boat and train to Paris, where I slept in the SCI France hostel in Clichy. The next 2 days were on trains to Zurich and then to Vorarlberg in the west of Austria. Here we stayed and worked for 5 weeks in a typical mountain village, Bartholomäberg, which was not accessible by road. In fact, our job was to build a road, just wide enough for a vehicle, and we did this by moving rocks and earth, working with pick and shovel, supervised by the local Bürgermeister, an elderly villager called Lorenzi. I sent a postcard home reporting on the mud and rain, asking for my leather boots to be sent urgently. The volunteers came from 12 countries. There were 2 Egyptians who brought with them propaganda material about President Nasser, and a loyal Israeli Arab who unfurled the Star of David on the summit of one of the mountains. We cooked and slept in a couple of the old farmhouses, and there was a little chance to wash. The panorama of mountain peaks speckled with snow was memorable when the sun shone, but seldom it did, and we were often enveloped in dank, vaporous cloud and soaked with rain. At work camps in those days, volunteers used to arrive and depart on different days. So after a few weeks, I'd become senior enough to become the camp leader. This involved persuading the volunteers to get out of bed. They were all older than me. I was also responsible for communicating with Lorenzi, and my German improved a lot. Bartholomeberg was very different when I visited in 2013. I found a wide tarmac road, an hourly bus service, and under every house where they used to keep the animals was a carport. But the mountain panorama was as stunning as ever. From Austria, I travelled by way of a few minor railway lines through the Black Forest to Metz in Lorraine in France. Both here and in the subsequent camp at Worms in Germany, we were working with local associations of families known as castors, beavers in English, to build houses to replace their homes lost in the war. After 20 years, they got ownership of the homes they had helped to build. At Metz, we worked in a field at the edge of the town, digging foundations for the new houses, and at another site where the houses had already been built, where we dug trenches and laid water pipes. It was hard, boring work. The leader of the camp was the General Secretary of SCI France, Etienne Reclus, another railway enthusiast, by the way, who was a hard taskmaster, but he frequently used to rush back to the office in Paris. Then we could lean on our shovels and relax a bit. At the Worms camp, the work was more interesting as we were involved in all the building process, barrowing sand and cement, mixing the cement, bricklaying, and the team included 3 notable volunteers. Ben Corley from what was still the Gold Coast, now Ghana, the first African volunteer to be invited to work camps in Europe, and a founder member of the Voluntary Work Camps Association of Ghana, VOLU. And Sam Balasundaram from Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, who ended up in the Soviet Union, and Devinder Das Chopra, a future leader of SCI in Asia and India. In between camps, I hitchhiked with Bill, a German friend I'd met at Metz across northern France, living mainly on bread and chocolate. I went on through Belgium, Luxembourg, and a little railway along the banks of the Moselle to join the work camp in Worms. After my 6 months as a work camper, I returned to London and finished my alternative service as a hospital porter at the Gordon Hospital for Diseases of the Colon and Rectum in the Vauxhall Bridge Road in London, where I became a member of the then mighty Transport and General Workers Union. The morning shift was hard and often disgusting work, but on the night shift, when there was nothing to do, I just sat at the switchboard learning Spanish and reading the Times, which I retrieved from the waste paper basket. There were several months before I was due to go to Cambridge. With school friends, we had a crazy plan to buy an old London taxi and drive to Italy in it. The deal fell through, so I sailed to Holland and hitchhiked to Germany and worked as a volunteer at a Lutheran study centre beside the River Ruhr, weeding carrots and onions, often in the pouring rain. I attended some of the church services and decided that religion sounded better in German. Bill came to visit me, we went off for a few days and many beers at Münster University. I then hitchhiked to Calais to meet up with school friends, and we hitchhiked to Sweden and Norway. Hitchhiking was popular and fairly safe in those days. We usually displayed the Union Jack. The British were still well liked after the war, but even this was of little help on the main road, not yet tarmac, between Oslo and Stockholm, where there was almost no traffic. Cambridge. I finally took up my place at St John's College, Cambridge, in October 1956. And after toying with the idea of studying languages, I read history. I loved Cambridge, but I was much less happy in the bigger university world, full of noisy, sporty public school types, than in my small, friendly boarding school. My friends were mostly people I'd known at school, but there were good moments. While at school, I'd supported the Liberal Party, but in the Suez Crisis, I reacted to the Prime Minister Anthony Eden's attack on Egypt by joining the Labour Party. I remember the high drama at Cambridge Union where Tory supporters were in full voice against the young Anthony Wedgwood Benn, later known as Tony Benn, who when he could be heard, made a brilliant attack on the Prime Minister Eden's foolishness and won the motion against the government. There was a protest meeting the following evening at which some rowdy Tories were shouting, "We want war," and later a huge anti-war meeting on Parker's Peace in Cambridge. I wrote a letter to R.A. Butler, then Lord Privy Seal, condemning the attack on Egypt. In the first long vacation in 1957, I hitchhiked with Brian Abbs to Stockholm and earned some money washing up at the unfortunately named SHT restaurant. I stayed in the Badminton Hall youth hostel and later shared a flat with two Austrians who were doing the same job. I earned a little over £1 a day, most of the time loading and emptying the dishwasher. The restaurant was not doing much business, so the work was not too tiring. Then Brian and I hitchhiked via Strasbourg, Geneva and Andorra to Spain, for which in those days a visa was required. The reality of Franco's dictatorship was reflected in the heavy presence of police on the buses and trains. The poverty of most of the people was striking. We had a kilometric ticket, which gave us cheap travel on the railway, and we took slow steam trains on narrow-gauge lines, as well as slightly faster trains to Barcelona, Madrid, Toledo, Cordoba and Seville. I remember being on the train from Girona to San Feliu de Guíxols and eating my first watermelon, peppered with smuts from the steam engine. From Seville, I took my first ever flight on a small plane across to Tetuan in Morocco, which cost less than £3. We found a bus to Qasr el-Kabir and then a very crowded train to the beautiful ancient city of Fez, returning to Tangier and a ferry to Algeciras in Spain, my first 3 days in Africa. In 1959, after leaving Cambridge, I took a temporary job teaching at my local Newport Grammar School. At the same time, I applied to do a postgraduate course paid for by the Colonial Office, which would start in September 1960. I was at the public library when I discovered the wonders of Thomas Cook's overseas rail timetable. This inspired me to plot a journey to India, where I planned to spend the 8 months before the course began. I asked IVSP if they had any suitable place for me in India. They had nothing that fitted my dates, so they suggested that I ask Voluntary Service Overseas, VSO, then a tiny organisation that had just sent out its first volunteer school leavers. I climbed up to their tiny office in grand buildings Trafalgar Square. Here I met Mohan Singh Mehta, the founder of Vidya Bhavan, an educational institute in India. He sounded interested and asked me to come for an interview in Geneva. I told him I couldn't go to Geneva, but I was going to India anyway and would happily meet him when I got there. So he told me just to turn up at Vidya Bhavan and we would arrange to be met when I got to Bombay. The next section is called A Passage to and from India, 1960. India, and especially the Gulf, have changed enormously in the last 68 years. Fortunately, I kept a diary, and I wrote many letters home, and these have helped me keep the experience of my journey alive. It was a week before my 24th birthday in January, when my mother saw me off at London's Victoria Station on the train to Dover. I had planned to go via Istanbul and take the Taurus Express through Turkey and Syria to Baghdad and Basra. I'd even bought a Bulgarian visa. But at that time, Syria was linked to Egypt as part of the United Arab Republic and had no diplomatic relations with Britain since the Suez attack of 1956. I had therefore to travel via Athens and Beirut. Getting off the ferry boat at Ostend, I was alone in the one coach labelled Athens. I was soon joined by a talkative English military man who was with me all the way to Greece. He'd worked as an advisor to the Greek army during the Civil War in 1944-49. To him, England was always blighty. At Brussels, the compartment filled up with a Belgian with a square face. This is a quote. A Belgian with a square face and a square body, and 5 Germans, one a very old widow with teeth missing. The population of the compartment changed at each stop. The first night took me through Germany into daylight in Bavaria and Austria, and after fierce frontier formalities to enter Yugoslavia, overnight again to Belgrade. 2 hours there, long enough to have an incredibly cheap breakfast and to notice that there were no cars on the street, only a tram and a horse and a cart. I wrote in my diary about Yugoslavia. Many of the roads were nothing but mud and water. The soil was poor, the grass sickly, the hills utterly barren, people fighting to get into a local train. Overnight again, and on the 3rd day, Blighty and I finally reached Athens. I had booked to sail on Olympic cruises to Beirut, but I had to wait one night before boarding the ship. I climbed up the Acropolis as the sun came up and shone brightly on the marble. A vivid rainbow appeared on a nearby hill. The only other thing I remember seeing in Athens was an escalator from the metro to the open air, an unusual sight in those days. The next morning, waiting in Piraeus for the ship, I watched the ceremony of the blessing of the water. A procession of Orthodox patriarchs bearing silver crosses advanced to a temporary podium. A Rolls-Royce drove up, and a group of military men got out, one of whom apparently was the King of Greece. All the ships in the harbour responded by hooting, and bells rang throughout the town. My ship, the SS Achilleus, was pleasantly luxurious, and the meals were enormous. The few other passengers included an English Quaker with an IVSP badge who was going to a work camp in Sudan, a Greek music teacher and his wife going to Beirut, a little Iraqi with a big moustache, and an unshaven German off to study community development in India. It was night when we sailed into Alexandria, and the famous lighthouse was flashing. An evangelical American missionary got on board. He was on his way from the pyramids to the Holy Land, but he seemed ignorant of anything that wasn't in the Bible. That night, with so few on board and little freight, the ship rolled drunkenly. I think I was the only passenger who did not look green in the face. I gorged myself alone in the restaurant. The ship stopped outside the port of Limassol in Cyprus, which was still British but to be independent in 8 months' time. On the final day, the sea was calm and the mountains of Lebanon rose up on the clear horizon. You could see the steep valleys and little towns and a line of white matchboxes which turned out to be the hotels and luxury flats of Beirut's glamorous Corniche. The ship was 11 hours late. It was already evening, and the plane I had booked for Kuwait was due to leave at 1 o'clock in the morning. All the taxis were large American cars. I took one to the home of Mr. Holmes of the British Embassy, who knew I was coming. He very kindly drove me to his office, gave me my Kuwait visa, and dropped me at the airline office. I still had a few hours to wander in the city. The streets were busy with an endless stream of mostly ancient buses with exhaust pipes pointing upwards. There were parked cars all over the pavements and lots of palm trees. Hole in the Head, They Came to Cordura, and several films with Arabic titles were showing in the many cinemas. A Lebanese friend at school had told me a little about the country, and he taught me the Arabic script, which was useful in reading Urdu later in Pakistan and India. There were only 5 of us on the plane to Kuwait, and a lot of boxes of oranges. I dozed off as we flew out over the sea to gain height over the mountains. I woke up over a strange, wrinkled sea. It was, of course, the desert. My schoolmate, Jennifer Edwards, known at school as Spiv, as she's dressed so smartly, met me at the airport, and she took me to the British India Steamship Company to buy my passage. I chose intermediate class with wooden beds, as Jennifer had offered to lend me an inflatable mattress. It took time getting a health certificate joining a queue of Arabs. We went for a drive to the desert, past oil tanks and a Bedouin tent. We had a drink with a group of bored American wives living in luxury and leading totally American lives. We got up at dawn the next morning, Monday the 11th of January, only to find the boat was delayed, so I had some time to see Kuwait. It was already a modern city with motorways, handsome mosques, and a secondary school so grand that it was dubbed the university, where all the students arrived in their own cars. Newly rich Kuwaitis had built themselves grand villas, and there were, I noted, more mosques than trees. At that time, Kuwait supplied 60% of Britain's oil, and the ruling sheikh had created a paternalistic little welfare state. Finally, to get on board the Santhia, I piled into a dhow, crowded with passengers and their bedsteads, radios and trunks. One man laid his Taj Mahal prayer mat on a tin trunk, faced Mecca, which was not in fact very far away, and prayed. The only gangway was for the first-class passengers, all 2 of them, while the rest of us waited our turn to clamber up into the ship. There were 8 bunks in intermediate class, occupied only by me and Abdallah, a friendly Adani who was also going to Bombay, now called Mumbai. 2 large Hindu ladies and another couple joined us at Bahrain the next day, where the sea was quite rough. Women and children had to be thrown into the arms of coolies or relatives at the foot of the gangway. I heard a white woman complaining that she had to be ferried in the same boat as the locals. While our ship waited overnight for some sheikh to arrive, Abdullah introduced me to a group of young Omanis travelling in the bunked section, the cheapest. They were happy to find a European who was not cocooned in the first class. There were also a number of Bahrainis on board, a cheerful lot who had a gramophone which played non-stop Arabic pop songs. We must have stopped at Doha and Abu Dhabi in the night, as I made no diary entries about them. On the Thursday morning, we reached Dubai. Given the metropolis that Dubai has become, I have to quote my exact description. Dubai, another sheikhdom but without oil. We anchor, as always, out at sea, and only the tiny line of ant-sized houses can be seen, and a row of date palms lining the seafront. I wish I'd had a camera. We also stopped at Sharjah, just a tiny fishing village as well. On the Friday, we woke up to different scenery. Weird rock formations, small jagged islands, the bare mountains of Persia, Iran in the distance. This was the Straits of Hormuz, where the Gulf, Persian or Arabian according to your allegiance, becomes the Gulf of Oman, and where both coastlines are visible at the same time. The Persian town of Bandar Abbas is, or was, built entirely of local stone and was invisible from a distance against the background of hills. The sea was utterly calm, and the evening was especially beautiful. As the sun went down, the rocks stood out black against the sky. First burnt yellow, then very burnt custard, then burnt orange, almost for a few minutes a pale mauve. The huge sun has gone, leaving the pink wash behind it in the sky. The moon comes up just as suddenly. It looked like a headlight, really superlative Cheshire cheese throwing its path across the sea, calm and silver, only clichés will describe it. Early on Saturday, we're hugging the rocky coast of Muscat, the capital of Oman. My diary comments, ruled by a bad sultan, also protected against his subjects by us. Muscat was a proper town, squashed into a cavity between rocks and sheltered by a rocky island. On these rocks were several picturesque castles and round watchtowers. The commercial centre, Matra, could be seen in the next bay. People and goods were ferried ashore by very light canoe-shaped boats, painted in almost African style. As we churned away from Muscat, I spent the day chatting about politics with a Bahraini called Ahmed. He was for democracy and against the sheikhs, which probably meant he was one of the Shia majority. In the evening, he invited me for coffee with some aged Bahrainis who were going to India for medical treatment. An imposing Pakistani sheikh came and sat with us and questioned me about Christian beliefs. I'm not sure that my attempt to describe the nature of the Trinity was very convincing. The next morning, we arrived outside Gwadur in Pakistan. The scenery was like the moon, with weird white cliffs around a small bay and no vegetation to be seen. This place had belonged to the Sultan of Muscat and Oman, but he gave it to Britain in lieu of a big debt, and Britain handed it on to Pakistan. The people here were Baluchis wearing woolly Russian-type hats. A week out from Kuwait, we reached Karachi. Abdallah and I went ashore, past appalling slums, riding in a tonga, that's a local horse-drawn taxi, to the National Museum, a dignified Victorian edifice complete with a statue of the Great Queen. Abdallah then found he needed some sex. It was hard to find a brothel open on a Monday afternoon. It looked very unattractive, so while I waited for him, I went and dined on a large biryani. Karachi was otherwise unimpressive. Camels were pulling little carts along narrow, dusty streets. There were donkeys, but few cars. After another night, the ship finally berthed beside the very British-looking harbour terminal in Bombay. A small shrimp-like man sent by the British Council came to bustle me through the customs. A difficult task, as everyone arriving from the Gulf was expected to have gold secreted on their person, and most were carrying large, shiny radiograms, cameras, watches and other items which required payment of an import duty. He took me in a taxi to a hotel on the marina. It was hot and humid. The next morning was a surprise to wake up cold in the overnight train going north towards Udaipur. I was to stay only 6 months at Vidya Bhavan School. The school had been established as a truly Indian project before independence, when this was the princely state of Mewar, not under direct British rule. It was part of a complex of different colleges, including a teachers' training college, a training school for Mukhya Sevikas, that means social workers, a rural institute, and a basic school which was run on Gandhian lines and concentrated more on spinning and craft, but it was free and therefore accessible to the poorest children. Vidya Bhavan was in a lovely setting surrounded by hills dotted with little bushes and small temples. It was a short walk from Fateh Sagar, an artificial lake built by one of the Maharanas, with pretty little white shelters along the dam wall and a palace in the middle, which has since been converted into a luxury hotel. Udaipur's sumptuous city palace had stables for the late Maharana's 90 elephants, the remaining one of which could be seen going for its walk through the streets. It was available for hire for wedding parties, one of which was in progress for 3 days just after I arrived, with a loud, squeaky band playing non-stop. The royal stables for the cavalry were equally enormous. This lovely old city has since become a tourist attraction, but it was good to live there when it was just its old self. My work was to improve the English of the secondary school pupils, who had few opportunities to speak the language. Class picnics were organised where everyone had to sing. I had to dig into my repertoire of work camp songs in various languages. My lessons didn't stop one boy from saying, "Bread eat monkey," when we cycled to visit the famous temple at Eklingji. This visit was one of the most vivid of my experiences in India. The entrance to the temple is guarded by 2 painted elephants, and gazing inwards towards the shrine of the god, Shiva, are 2 cows, one black and one bronze. Women were frantically worshipping in one corner, and there was a buzz of children's voices. Only the inner sanctum of the temple had not been left undamaged during the Mughal invasions of the 16th century. Police stopped me at the door, but my friend Sood explained that I was not a foreigner, but a pale-skinned Hindu from Kashmir, and I was allowed inside. A confused memory of coloured cloth, paper hangings, erotic carvings, and the 4 faces of Shiva. I stayed in the Teachers' College hostel, defeating bed bugs and mosquitoes and adapting to the diet of dal and vegetable curry which was served in the college canteen. I made many friends among the college students and several Anglophile families and learned quite a lot of Hindi. I earned a bit of extra pocket money teaching the children of an American family. Staff meetings were a trial. I was not good at sitting cross-legged on the floor. My Hindi was not up to it, so I would hide in the corner reading the Observer newspaper which my mother mailed to me each week. On Sunday mornings we used to go to English Picture at the Chetak Cinema. The films were mostly American, and people came to see kissing, which was never quite allowed to happen in Indian films. They did not understand a word, and they talked all the way through. One weekend I was invited to visit Mayo College in Ajmer, a night's train ride away. The college was founded in 1876 as a school for princes, and it claims still to be the best school in India. It was a contrast to Vidya Bhavan, a Victorian bathroom, a school museum, residential boarding houses and housemasters, even whiskey to drink. I met 4 English public school boys who were there, like me, as volunteers. The one who showed me around the school, I later realised, was David Nobbs, who was to become a great writer of comedy and the creator of The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin, a television series. It was the weekend of Holi, the spring festival which celebrates the triumph of good over evil. Normally, coloured powder and water is thrown around, but because there was an epidemic of mumps, the schoolboys were limited to coloured powder, which was less likely to transmit the infection. The scene in the city streets would probably have been more exciting. As I was about to leave, the current Maharana of Udaipur, who happened to be visiting Ajmer, gave me a lift to the station in his old Rolls-Royce. After a little over 3 months, it was time for the long school holidays, and I set off to see India. First to Mount Abu in the north, Rajasthan, to see the amazing white carvings at the Dilwara Jain temples. Then a long train journey south, including a lot of bedbugs in the waiting room at Bhopal, and my first experience of trying to eat dosa and sambar with either very dirty hands or an equally dirty spoon. Reaching Madras, which is now called Chennai, I got a cycle rickshaw to Cherian Nagar, where I was to attend a work camp. For 2 years, Indian and foreign SCI volunteers had been working in this fisherman's neighbourhood, helping to build nearly 200 mud houses for people relocated from slums. At first sight, the place looked rather like a slum, but in fact, each cottage had a bathroom and a latrine behind. We distributed milk powder and sometimes wheat, ran a dispensary every afternoon, and bathed the children on Sundays. Then I moved on to visit some of the stunning temples of Tamil Nadu. I stopped in the former French city of Pondicherry, with its puce and cream houses reminiscent of New Orleans. It was featured in The Life of Pi. France had only recently handed its small enclaves back to India, and the place still felt very French. Back in Madras, I visited the world headquarters of the Theosophical Society, outside which stands the most amazing banyan tree with its many drooping branches forming new tree trunks. I returned to the work camp, where I succeeded in burning 2 cauldrons by trying to cook a European meal of spaghetti followed by stewed mangoes. Back north, on a comfortable third-class air-conditioned train, I visited the famous painted caves at Ajanta, spent a couple of days in Delhi, and continued to Punjab, where I was invited to stay in the small town of Dera Baba Nanak by my friend Bedi from the Teachers' College. Bedi is a descendant of Guru Nanak, who was the first Sikh guru. I gave talks at 2 local schools about the UK and about the English language. Kashmir at this time was peaceful. I arrived at Srinagar on a bus, twisting and turning on the mountainous road. I stayed on a houseboat on the shore of the lake and spent the little money I had on some of the very fine local handicrafts and a tailor-made overcoat, which was to be useful on my journey home through Russia. I went in a bus up the mountain to Gulmarg. Indian tourists came there to experience snow. I took one look at it and just cowered, shivering in the nearby hotel. Back in the lowlands, I stopped in Chandigarh. This is the strikingly modern capital city of the Indian province of Punjab, built because the original capital, Lahore, ended up in Pakistan. It was designed by the great French architect Le Corbusier. From there, I took the little steam railway which climbed up the mountains to Shimla, a cold and misty, very British hill station with mock Tudor houses and hotels. Final stops on the way back to Udaipur were at the Taj Mahal in Agra, which I reached just as the monsoon burst. You've seen many pictures of it, but you're still stunned as it comes into view. I stopped at the extensive Mughal ruins of Fatehpur Sikri on the way to the lovely capital of Rajasthan, Jaipur, where I caught up again with Dr. Mohan Singh Mehta, who had given me the job at Vidya Bhavan in the first place. He was the Vice-Chancellor of the university there. Life returned to normal for my final 2 months at Vidya Bhavan, and it was good to be back among so many friends and the schoolboys and girls who seemed to like me. The most exciting event was the Shia festival of Muharram. We watched from a balcony a procession of tizias, replicas of Hussein's tomb, some as tall as the houses, snaking through the narrow streets. Young men beat themselves shouting, "Hussein, Hussein!" I then had word that I'd been accepted for the postgraduate education course in London, and therefore I had to be home by the end of September. My journey home took me to Delhi, but first I diverted to visit the very aged Vinoba Bhave, who had been a leading follower of Mahatma Gandhi, and he had initiated the Bhudan movement, which urged landowners to make gifts of land. We arrived just in time to follow the old man and his followers up the hill for prayers. He was living at Kasturba Gram, the ashram named after Mahatma Gandhi's wife. He gave me time for a short interview, and we talked about how SCI had introduced international voluntary service to India when Pierre Cerisol had come to Bihar in 1934. In Delhi, I struggled through the bureaucracy to get permission to take money out of India, to get visas for Afghanistan and the USSR, and to get on the one daily train that crossed into Pakistan. In Lahore, in Pakistan, I saw Jahangir's tomb and the Shalimar Gardens, a city of faded glory. 2 more trains on, arriving in Peshawar, I had a morning to wander around the bazaar and negotiate Afghan currency and a visa. The Khyber Pass, dry and rocky, seemed peaceful enough. The little bus was full of burly Afghans with huge trunks full of goods they had bought in Pakistan. The new customs building on the Afghan side boasted a waiting room for foreigners with magazines and free cigarettes. I slept so well in the government hostel in Jalalabad that I delayed our departure in the morning. Our little bus climbed and zigzagged through the mountains. This, the only road to Afghanistan, was narrow and not yet tarred. It was just becoming the hippie trail to and from India. Arriving in Kabul, I had a meal of meat and spinach, and found a cheap hotel. The next morning I was driven to the airport, where the terminal consisted only of tents. I boarded a small Aeroflot plane, which flew very near the Hindu Kush mountains, capped with parcels of snow on the north side. We dipped low over the Amudarya River, which forms the frontier with the Soviet Union, Uzbekistan, and over small irrigated fields to land at a deserted airstrip, where in a rather cosy waiting room, warmed by a big ceramic stove, we went through immigration procedures. On to Tashkent, where I changed onto my first ever jet plane to fly overnight to Moscow. In those days, tourists were strictly controlled, and you had to buy a tourist day for £10 with a guide, or £5 without a guide. I had bought two of the former, one for Moscow, one for Leningrad, but apparently any Russian visa was only for Moscow, and I spent hours getting it extended for Leningrad. As I had little money, I was angry and almost in tears. The lady in the agency said, "Why are you so nervous?" The Moscow deal included a guide, a mousy woman wearing a red cardigan. She was friendly, but she seemed to think demolishing old buildings was a good idea. She kept saying rather obvious things like, "Well, we are in Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union." She reluctantly took me on a visit to a working church, and we toured the Kremlin, saw the city from the 25th floor of the university, and rode on the metro, where I noticed that the mosaics of one or two disgraced leaders had been bricked over. Then I took the train to Leningrad, having paid my extra £5 for a day there. I wandered around the beautiful city, now called St. Petersburg, and looked at the famous Finland station where Lenin arrived in 1917. However, my train to Finland left from the Moscow station, and I was one of only 4 passengers on it. Most of the houses on both sides of the border were built of wood, but in Finland they were painted in bright colours. I was suffering from some kind of rheumatism, and I hobbled around Helsinki before taking the overnight ferry to Stockholm. Here I was welcomed by my school friend Brian Abbs, who was developing his English language teaching expertise in the excellent Swedish adult education system. More trains and ferries brought me finally to England. I had no money left and could only gaze at the spread on the boat. Landing at Harwich, I had to call my mother, reversing the charges, to ask for her to meet me at Bartlow Station with enough money to pay for my train fare. The notes I made on 1960 India are fairly obvious ones. 13 years after independence, British influences were still strong. These included tomato sauce on the table, toast and tea for breakfast in government rest houses, the magnificent railways, especially Bombay and Madras stations, the hill stations, which felt like British seaside resorts with mountains instead of sea, schools such as Mayo College, double-deck buses and trams, the Times of India and other newspapers with a passion for English literature and a passion for English among the educated. It was Nehru's heyday. The Congress Party was totally dominant, and it was the year of the second 5-year plan. A tradition of popular demonstration had developed during the struggle for independence. During my time in India, there was a campaign for a Punjabi-speaking, mainly Sikh province. There were riots in Assam and demonstrations in the south against the imposition of the Hindi language. In fact, there were 2 Indias: the educated, modernizing, polluting, industrializing minority, and the masses living in terrible poverty in the villages and in the city slums, bound by unchanging tradition and culture. I thought that the obstacles to modernization would never be overcome, but it seems today that the middle classes are winning, but the poor are still in the majority. In later years, I visited India a number of times for my work, usually for meetings. My father had died during this first visit, and it happened that my mother died when I was at a meeting in Nagpur in 1994. I visited Afghanistan once more, also for work, in 1975. At that time, Kabul was still peaceful, and the hippie trail was still busy. On that occasion, I was looked after by the British Council and the embassy. We went for a picnic on the road towards Pakistan, now fully tarmac, but with no insecurity. I also went north to Kunduz by bus through the tunnel through the Hindu Kush. But I had omitted to put a film in my camera, so I had to buy every postcard I could find. I was researching a possible volunteer program in Afghanistan, but nothing came of the idea.